Hey everybody, it's me, Mr. K, coming at you with some virtual notes. So, as this week we started our podcast unit, so the next few weeks we're going to be creating a podcast. But before we can do that, we need to explore the different types of podcasts that there are. So, the first type of podcast we're going to talk about is a storytelling podcast. This is a style that a lot of podcasts use, and it basically has the narrator or both narrators telling a story from their perspective. So we're going to explore techniques of storytelling that make that storytelling good, that make you want to continue listening to it. Okay, so let's get started. So the first technique of storytelling that we're going to talk about today is conflict. Okay, conflict is something that adds suspense or tension to a story. And now conflicts can be either internal or external. So an internal conflict, an example of that would be someone having a hard time at making a decision because that thought process, that decision is going on in their head. For example, like if you're trying to decide if you should break up with your girlfriend or not, that's an internal conflict. It's something that's going on inside of you, and people outside of you might not really know what's going on. On the flip side, we have external conflict. And external conflicts are normally like some kind of physical conflict, like an obstacle in the way of somebody reaching their goal. So if the one thing I need to do to graduate is to pass gym, then I need to do whatever the requirement is for gym. I need to complete that. That's a physical obstacle. It's something I need to do. Or if I want to ask a girl out, but she has a boyfriend and I need to beat him up first, that's an external conflict, right? Okay, so I want you to take a second now. On your notes, write down an example of conflict in a story. Any story you can think of. I'm going to ask you to go ahead and pause the video at this point because I'm going to move on pretty quickly. So pause the video, write down your conflict example, and then you can play again when you're ready. Okay, so the next storytelling technique that we're going to talk about is called dramatic arc, or sometimes this is called plot. So most stories should have a clear beginning, a clear middle, and an end. This is dramatic arc. Now, most of the time throughout this arc, there are one or multiple characters that go through some kind of change, whether that's an emotional change or a physical journey. The characters should be experiencing something like that. Otherwise, if there's no change, if there's no journey, there's not really a good story there. And in the end, these characters should not be the same as they were in the beginning. Most times these characters go through some sort of change or growth. Okay. Moving on. The next storytelling technique we're going to talk about today is developed characters. So developed characters versus undeveloped characters, we're gonna compare the two. So a developed character has a backstory, like you know something about them, you know something about their life. They have personality. You're able to read about them and be like, oh, like they're really sarcastic or they're really funny. They have some kind of personality that you can pick out. And the author just tends to give details that make them seem real. The more details you have about something, the more you're going to be able to visualize it, and the more you're going to be able to connect with that character. So on the other side, we have undeveloped characters. Undeveloped characters are boring. They don't have a personality or a backstory, or if they do have one, it's very small, and they're just not memorable. They're the type of character that you read about, and then later on you can't remember their name. They're just not a good character. So in the podcast that you'll be creating, if you choose to do a storytelling podcast, you want to have developed characters, not undeveloped characters. You want your characters to be interesting, and you want them to have personality, and you want your listeners to be able to connect with that character. And if they're boring and not memorable, that's not going to happen. Okay, next storytelling technique we're talking about today is the setting, having an interesting setting. So one of the keys to having an interesting setting, stories, a lot of really good stories take you to a place that you cannot go yourself. right? It's taking you to somewhere where you don't get to experience, but the author is able to describe the setting to you, and through that you're able to experience it. If the author was taking me to like the school, which you guys have all been to and you all know about, that's not super exciting, right? Now, on the flip side, if the author is taking you somewhere like that you've never been to, they're describing it, that's something that you're going to want to pay attention to, because they're describing the setting and you don't know what's going on, and they're going to kind of like pull you into the scene by telling you what is going on. So some of the examples of an interesting setting, an author can take you like behind the scenes of an event. So maybe you know what happened, like maybe you watched what happened, but now he's going to explain what was going on in the characters' minds, what was going on in the background that you didn't know about. That's an interesting setting. Maybe the author can take you inside their home. Unless you're really close friends with them, going inside their home is not something that you'll have done before, and so you get to experience how like what their home is like, how their family interacts, and that's not something that you would know how that all works, right? And then thirdly, they can take you to a location that you've never been to. So say they travel overseas and they're in Europe, or they're in Venice or something like that, someplace that you've never been, right? Okay, moving on. The next type of storytelling technique we're going to talk about is reflection. So a reflection is when a character explains what they learned from their experiences. A lot of times in a podcast, or even in like a movie or a TV show, it's the end of the show where the character's like, so after all this happened, here's the thing that I took away from it. Here's what I learned from this experience. Okay, that is a reflection. They explain how this experience they went through changed them, or made them grow, or made them better or worse. And sometimes they give you advice on what you should do if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, because this is something that they've experienced, but maybe it's not something you've experienced, and they want you to be better prepared for whatever that experience is if you ever experience it in your life. Okay, the last storytelling technique we're going to talk about today is great sounds. So in this situation when we're talking about a podcast, it's all audio. There's no visual aspect of this that they can watch and understand what's going on. It's all audio. So you need to think about certain things differently than if you were to record like a video, right? For example, is your character's voice interesting? Do they have an accent? Do they have some kind of tone in their voice that lets the reader identify that character? What can you tell? What can you tell about the character from their voice? Are they sad? Are they stressed out? Are they happy? What's going on there? Okay. You also want to be thinking about what other interesting sounds you can include in your podcast, like maybe in the background, to set the story. So if it's a story that's set at school, maybe you can include some sounds of like students talking in the background, and maybe like someone turning a page of their book or something like that. Those are all background sounds that aren't going to be part of the main story, but kind of frame the story and kind of get you into the mindset of, okay, we're in a school. Those sounds will pull you into the story more. The other thing you can ask is, how did the character make you feel? Does it make you feel? Did it draw you into the story? Does it make you feel interested? Did the character make you feel uncomfortable? If it's a bad guy, maybe making you feel uncomfortable is a good thing, right? These are all things that you can think about when you're recording a podcast. So before we wrap up today, what I want you to do on your notes is, so this list that we went through today is not a complete list. So I want you to try to think of another way to make a story more interesting for a podcast. And I want you to write down on your notes. Okay, this is all for today. And I will post the next assignment tomorrow. Thank you guys for joining me.